Hello everybody, welcome to the Wonky Angle, where I talk about electronic music, both new and old. And today it's time for another Worst and Best ranking. Well, it appears we have lost yet another legend. Just the other day, it was announced that Andy Barker, a key member of 808 State since 1989, unfortunately passed away due to some unspecified illness, leaving Graham Massey as the sole remaining member of the band. As such, I thought it was only right that I pay my tributes to Barker and discuss this band in the only format I hadn't already talked about them before, much like I did for Kraftwerk when Florian Schneider passed away. Now, I've already made my thoughts on this band clear through my actual discography review of them years ago. Here's an extra posthumous thank you to Andy for having shared my old top 10 list on Facebook back around the time I had posted that. But for those unfamiliar, 808 State are easily comparable in terms of impact on my personal life as Kraftwerk were. I got into them in 6th grade fairly shortly after getting into Kraftwerk, who alongside Orbital and Air were my only exposure to electronic music at all at the time. And on top of that, they, alongside Mathematics, were the first electronic artists I discovered purely by myself, thanks to finding them in an old iTunes Essentials playlist. I was so taken by their wild and crazy stylings and got completely hooked into all of their material, and that was all even before I discovered how formative they were to electronic music as a whole with their pioneering acid house work from the late 80s. This entire genre as we know it would not look the same without these guys, but even without that context, they're just one of my personal favorite bands of all time. And you can absolutely credit them as a part of how I got so obsessed with this genre in the first place. As such, I felt a tribute video was necessary once I heard this news. So, may as well get the usual disclaimers out of the way. A reminder as per usual that this is my opinion and you can feel free to disagree with it. This is primarily going by which projects mean the most to me personally. Respect for some projects' place in history did get taken into account, but never really became like a make or break thing. This is just my own ranking based on what projects I personally enjoy listening to the most, and your ranking could be completely different from mine. And I might not even agree with it myself later. None of it is set in stone, just reflects how I feel at the moment of recording the video. So, all that's worth keeping in mind, and without any further ado, this is... 808 State, Worst to Best. At number 8, with an asterisk, I have Quadrastate. I actually don't count this as a main album of theirs. I feel like it's more of an EP, and that shaky status led to this kind of just getting the bottom spot by default. But some people do consider this a proper album, and I'd seen multiple people disappointed that I didn't do a video on it way back when I actually did my discography review of them, so I decided to include it in this ranking as a bonus. It is the point at which Andy Barker became a full-time member of the band, so I guess it is relevant to mention. If I did consider this project a main album, it would still be my least favorite of theirs overall, but don't think that means I don't like this project. I still think Quadrastate is quite good. Obviously, its main selling point is the original version of Pacific State, and while I have more of a preference towards the 202 version on 90, this more lo-fi original still retains all the chill atmosphere you'd want, with even more retro texturing. Of course, then it's rudely interrupted by 106, which is a very interlude of intense 80s keyboards. And the other tracks that follow can kind of feel a bit repetitive and underdeveloped in comparison to the material they'd come out with afterwards. Though not to say any of them are bad either. They all deliver lots of old school house grooves that are still as fun and danceable now as they were back in the day. I'd say State to State is probably the other biggest highlight here. Really quite like its bass line and plinky melodies. State Ritual is a lot of fun in spite of how unstable it sounds. Disco State's groove is as good as its title might imply. And Firecracker is plenty of fun too in a similar way to all the other tracks here. And there also exists a reissue version of this project that adds 7 bonus tracks and stretches it out to the length of an actual album. And while pretty much none of them are as good as the original core tracks, and the 2 remixes at the end feel kind of unnecessary and tacked on, I suppose they do help make this project feel more like a complete experience. I liked Got It Huh with Zenarchy and the ambient cut in Yoke. And you also get their debut singles Let Yourself Go and Deepville, back from the days when Gerald was still on board, which are nice as a curiosity even if neither are particular favorites. This project is still all around pretty good, but it is the one where I feel the least of a personal connection with, and it still never really felt right to call it an actual album. It felt like something of a side curiosity in a transitional moment than the next big step forward for the band, at least for me. But on the other hand, it is still a pretty iconic classic whether I like it or not. It does have some of their most recognizable cuts, and it is pretty neat as a bridge between New Build and 90 that sort of combines both albums' approaches in an interesting way. Still absolutely worth giving a shot if you've never heard it. Their other projects just so happen to give me stronger urges to come back for more, and I think it says something about my standards for this band when they have 7 other projects that I'd rather come back to than this. Whoopsh. And number 7, I have New Build. Alright, let's get my worst take on these guys out of the way. New Build here also is not much of an album. It's over in just under 40 minutes, and its 7 tracks are basically just the exact same groove throughout their entire running time with pretty much no progression over time, or even that much variety from track to track. It's also an album that doesn't sound as fresh and new by today's standards as it probably did back in 1988. On the other hand, this was also pretty much the album that popularized Acid House in the UK and basically set off the entire explosion of great electronic music coming out of the UK in the following decade. Giant names like Aphex Twin and Outtaker have gone on record to say this album was really formative and inspirational to them. Needless to say, electronic music as we know it today would not look the same without this album. The album is primarily the brainchild of Gerald Simpson, who broke off the band shortly after the album's release in order to focus on his own solo career as A Guy Called Gerald, which also turned out to deliver tons of more interesting and groundbreaking material that arguably even stayed more ahead of the curve than the rest of 808 State themselves could. I'll put a card up there if you want to see the full discography review I just recently did on him. But on a more personal level, even if I do believe this project is fairly flawed and underdeveloped by today's standards, and it mostly falls within the shadows of what both the band did and Gerald did solo afterwards, especially the latter's Hot Lemonade album, which is basically a far superior continuation on the ideas explored here, I do still come back to New Build every now and then and still enjoy it for what it is. Its historical context does imbue it with this monumental sense of importance that you can tell no one working on it at the time was really expecting it to have. The future of music stumbled upon by a bunch of young guys from Manchester doing whatever they felt like with the equipment they could afford. And where most of their projects afterwards had much more of a poppy sheen to them and commercial polish, this has a lot more of a raw and inventive experimental edge to it that totally sets it apart from all their other projects. Even if it's obvious this album could not have come out today and made the same splash it did back then, the grooves it does deliver are no less solid and danceable, made even more odd and alien by the scrappy lo-fi presentation of everything, from the iconic slapping synth bass of Sink/Swim to the entirely TP303-driven grooves of Flow Coma and Narcosa, and the repetitive samples of Dr. Lowfruit and Compulsion. Maybe some cuts, especially those latter two, could get a tad grating if I'm not in the right mood, but still, if you just want acid music distilled down to its purest form, New Build remains an absolutely essential listen in that department. For me, it's still something that I have more respect for than I viscerally enjoy, but if this is your favorite album of theirs, I totally get it. Also, if this project is your favorite, you may want to also check out Pre-Build, the 2004 compilation of unreleased material that didn't make the cut for this album. Pretty neat insight into the days of Gerald Simpson's tenure into the band, and even more like that guy's solo album than New Build was. Featuring a couple of tracks with absolute dogshit audio quality. It's nothing essential, but it's a neat curiosity for those curious on my thoughts. Though if you wanted the ideas explored on New Build further developed on a longer album like that, I can think of a different example that played out significantly better. And number 6, I have Transmission Suite.
Fantastic.
Alright, the comeback album. It may seem like blasphemy to put a project like this over a classic like New Build, one that is so obviously trying to recapture that old magic of their earliest material decades later and has none of the game-changing importance of the stuff it's trying to recreate. But I don't think that's entirely fair to this album. First of all, Transmission Suite feels way more complete and properly fleshed out into a full album experience in comparison with New Build. Much better sonically varied, with tracks that feel like they have more of a sense of purpose and direction, can maybe change up a bit more, and retain a tiny bit of that sense of off-the-wall unpredictability that first got me to fall in love with their stuff. Also, I feel like this album takes the same retro aesthetics from their debut and really leans into how dated they can feel by today's standards, giving them a totally different kind of charm that maybe feels spookier and perhaps a bit more self-aware. I also like how it brings their career full circle, how this last album more resembles their debut than any of their other stuff. I do still stand by my opinions from my review that I don't quite love this album. As much as I do like this retro minimalist side to 808 State, it was their goofy and poppy material that first got me to fall in love with them when I was a kid, and this project really downplayed that side to their sound. Also, the pacing can be a bit hit and miss. Not every one of these 15 tracks is as interesting as the next, and a decent handful of them just kind of blend into the background. But that's certainly not to take away from all the standouts, from the retro acid grooves of Tokyo Tokyo, 1313, and Cannonball Waltz, the melodic IDM house-leaning material like Skylon, Carbonate, and Huronic, the more abrasive cuts like Bushy Bushy and Crab Claw, or cuts like Ujala, Westland, and Trinity, which channel a lot more of that playful energy I always loved out of these guys. This is still absolutely a solid album, just not quite as unique or out of the box as these guys could be at their best. Whoopsh. And number 5, I have Outpost Transmission. Well, if Transmission Suite wasn't unique or out of the box enough, their previous album here definitely does not have that problem. I can't think of any album that sounds quite like Outpost Transmission. It's off-the-wall mix of experimentalism going down much darker territory from their earlier material, but still retaining that goofy veneer and occasional bits of their poppier leanings. One moment it could feel like a crashing pitch-black mess of breakbeats and synth squelching, another it could have some more tuneful vocal guests chiming in, and all of it has an oddly cartoonish veneer that I've previously gone on record to say was akin to being in an evil stir-fry restaurant that wants to kill you. Now, this album still isn't among their most consistent. There are a lot of cuts here that don't really stick out to me and kind of meander without any sense of structure or tune to tie it all together. Especially at the end of the US version I'm used to, with cuts like Dissidus, Brown Sauce, Doctors and Nurses, etc. But the moments that do hit from here have always stuck with me. 606 is an excellent poppy house R&B cut to kick things off. That whole 5-track run of Bent, Souflex, Crossword, Lung Fu, and Quincy's Lunch have so many cool textures that totally pull me in, and surprisingly solid hooks that work in spite of how abstract they are, much as the best 808 State material can pull off. And even in spite of all the strange experimentations this album embarks upon that can be harder to connect with, even in its worst moments, I gotta give them points for taking risks and going out of their way to make their already weird sound even weirder. Even if on some level, Transmission Suite does make more sense as like a self-reflective swan song, where this felt more like a bizarre detour and a weird place to just leave their career hanging for 17 years. There's still definitely enough reason to come back to this one every now and then, and an experience that is absolutely unlike anything else out there. But now it's time to really get into the meat of their catalog and the 4-album run they had where all my nostalgia for them is most intensely concentrated. Whoopsh. And number 4, I have Gorgeous. Raise the feeling. Raise the feeling. All the 808 State albums I have ranked under this are still good to great, but this is the point in the ranking where we're getting into the stuff that I always think about when I think about 808 State. The stuff that makes them one of my favorite bands of all time. Even if I know this one won't be the case for everyone watching. See, Gorgeous is kind of 808 State's big pop sellout move, the point at which their sound went towards an even more commercial 90s style that bleeds cliches from this era, and many would argue ditches a lot of what made 808 State so unique in the first place, for the sake of features from the likes of Ian McCulloch from Echo and the Bunnymen, and UB40. It's true that this is easily their poppiest and most commercial album, but I don't care. For me, this was yet another home run for the band, and proved that they could seamlessly work these more commercial 90s styles into their sound, and still remain easily recognizable as 808 State. And honestly, a lot of the more atmospheric focus of this album and its stronger hooks leads to an experience that I've developed an even more visceral emotional attachment to than other albums which stuck to their signature sound a lot more closely. I for one always liked tracks like Moses and 1 in 10 for how instantly catchy they were in spite of how controversial they might be with other fans. And if you can somehow resist the gospel chorus and crazy change-ups of 10 times 10, I'm not sure how you would do that, really. But not as much of this album is as poppy and radio-friendly as you'd think. There's loads of atmospheric instrumental cuts like Plan 9, Orbit, Black Morpheus, and Southern Cross that absolutely live up to the album's title and are often the biggest highlights of the album for me. And even if the album does noticeably dip in quality after the latter cut, the back half still has no shortage of crazy bangers like Nimbus, Colony, or Stormin' Norman. And the album ending in such a goofy left hook like Sexy Synthesizer. I mean, I don't think anyone can deny that leaves an impact. It's definitely not their most creative endeavor. It's not the album of theirs I have the most respect for, and I can't fully ignore it sliding off in the last third. It's definitely not a tight listen. My next two picks are much more consistent and better paced, but I hold the high points on this one even closer to me. If I were looking at these albums, thinking which one I would be more in the mood for, and maybe Plan 9 happened to slip into my mind, my decision would be made. If this one really fell flat for you, I would get it. I wouldn't really recommend it as your starting point if you've never heard an 808 State album before, but I am absolutely not too good for any of this, and I love the entire experience from front to back, sexy dancer and all. Now, if you want me to recommend the best starting point for those trying to get into 808 State for the first time, I think I would have to point you towards this next one. Whoopsh. And number 3, I have 90. Okay, this is the one moment in the ranking where I decided to go against where my nostalgia is the strongest, because I feel this album is the definitive 808 State experience, and where I would most recommend any newcomers would start if they've never heard any albums from these guys before. A project that demonstrates their core appeal in an experience that adds up to just under 40 minutes without feeling underdeveloped, has even less commercial pop leanings, and just so happens to also have the same sense of giant historical importance that New Build does, while having aged astronomically better. So many sonic cliches through the 90s dance scene got their start on this album and still feel perfectly fresh to this day. I mean, the later albums show 808 State as just part of the giant crowd of unique UK electronic bands I love coming out of the early 90s, but 90 shows them leading that crowd, and doing stuff that would become inspirations for all those bands. Also, it has the best version of their best song, Pacific 202. Such a classic standout track from this entire era that I fell so much in love with. It might even get me to tear up sometimes. But there's not a single weak point on the rest of the album either. The random side tracks, thick acid bass lines, and banging beats throughout the likes of Cobra Bora and Donkey Doctor, which have especially been massive growers as of the last couple of years. The perfect nailing of the random disconnected hooks formula that became their hallmark with Ancodia and 808080808. The beautiful but off-kilter poppy ambience created by Sunrise and Magical Dream. It's all fantastic. Even if Magical Dream is far from their best atmospheric pop song, it's got an odd sense of, amateurishness to it, as if it's coming from underground legends trying their hands at a regular pop song for the first time, and has its own offbeat charm in that way. If I want to be brutally honest, I would say I do still have a stronger personal attachment to their following two albums than I do to this one. But it's really not by much, if that, and I feel like both my respect for its game-changing status and its still fresh, out-of-the-box creativity could override that. This is probably the 808 State album I would most highly recommend to other people. Also helps that the album has been growing on me a lot, and I've felt compelled to come back to it a lot more than I ever used to. When I was a kid, a lot of this stuff might have still felt a bit too out there and structuralist for me to connect with as deeply as the stuff they did afterwards, but now that exact element is exactly what I like the most about it in the greater context of their catalog. It's the one moment where the press at the time, the modern-day reviewers, the 13-year-old me, and the 26-year-old me can all most easily fully agree with the sentiment. Man, 808 State are freaking awesome. Well, this and my next pick. Whoopsh. And number 2, I have XL. It was actually really difficult to figure out where to place this in comparison with Gorgeous and 90. It's functionally a three-way tie. This was at number 4 when I started writing this ranking, and these 3 albums could switch their spots around depending on my mood. But yeah, there aren't many albums in their catalog that better demonstrates the core appeal of 808 State quite as succinctly as XL, which is just as consistent as 90, but delivering even more of it, and with even stronger personal nostalgia from when I was in middle school. So many of their most recognizable cuts like Cubic, In Your Face, Lift, Oops, and Olympic show up here, and there's not a single weak point in the bunch. Not only do we have plenty of cuts that follow the usual 808 State formula of random shit happening on top of a beat and ricocheting between lots of disconnected but equally catchy hooks, as seen on San Francisco, Nefertiti, Leo Leo, or Technobell. Also pretty much all the singles I'd already mentioned. Every single one just takes you on its own bizarre and off-the-wall journey that can alternatively bang or end up intriguingly atmospheric, sometimes within the same track, and still always end up sticking in your head in their entirety, in spite of how disjointed they can sometimes be. But there's also a surprising amount of high-profile guest features who come to sing weird offbeat pop songs. See Bernard Sumner on Spanish Heart, and freaking Björk who shows up on both Oops and Q-Mart. Name me any album in existence that has 2 tracks with prominent guest features from Björk, let alone 2 tracks as incredible and immediate as these. The big singles do tend to also be the biggest highlights for me, In Your Face rising the highest of them all for me. But even when I think a cut might fall short from the crowd, like Empire or Lambrusco Cowboy, I come back to this album and they end up absolutely kicking ass. This album's got so much personality and flair and creativity, the kind of material that no one but 808 State could possibly come up with. It's an absolute freaking masterwork and a must listen, and heck, it could work equally as well as 90 as a starting point for those looking to get into this band for the first time. But even if I have changed my mind a lot on how this album holds up next to 90 and Gorgeous, I think we all know my top pick had already been decided at least a decade ago, so let's get into that. Whoopsh. At number 1, I have Don Solaris. Look, 90 and XL may be classics, but Don Solaris is one of the only albums in existence I know for a fact I would award a perfect 10 out of 10 score, and I can count those on one hand. Now, I'm well aware that I kind of go against the grain with this take. While most I've seen at least think it's pretty good, I'm pretty much the only guy I know who thinks this album is that level of great. And I will not deny that personal nostalgia plays into that very heavily. This album does lean away from the quirkier house bangers they're known for and have more of a tendency towards atmospheric, music-y material, as some have described it. And I can definitely understand why that wouldn't be some people's cup of tea. Though I've also seen Pacific State described as music in that same way, so come on. Though while I'm on that observation, I don't think it'd be inaccurate to say Don Solaris is kind of like if 808 State reverse-engineered Pacific 202 for an entire album. Got every single track to have the same depth, level of detail, and polish and sense of environment as that old classic, maybe combined with efforts to make more experimental twists on the vocal pop excursions of Gorgeous, and the result is nothing short of breathtaking from start to finish. Every single track feels like it sets up its own unique environment, with each one perfectly leading into the next as if you're being taken on a grand epic journey through some exotic alien planet which is mostly like Earth but not quite the same. And every track is really memorable and has its own hook, even if occasionally abstract. And all the vocal guests, from Mike Doty to Louise Rhodes to James Dean Bradfield to Raga, absolutely kill it with all their performances, perfectly complementing all their respective tracks and adding their own unique personalities. I can sing along with every lyric regardless of whether I actually understand what's being said. There's a perfect balance between low-key atmospheric material like Black D'Artagnan, Kohoutek, Lopez, and Moose, and intense and dark banger material like Bond, Azura, and Balboa, or some of the most uplifting and sunny bangers they've ever put out like Joyrider and Bird, and the absolute bundle of pure joy that is Jerusa Hat. And of course there's Banachek, which may very well be my favorite album closer of all time, because I've never heard any other album that ends in the particular way this one does, and pulls it off this effectively. Following up such a perfect note of warm and fuzzy and reassuring closer like Jerusa Hat, with a complete fuck you to that track that absolutely obliterates the atmosphere of all the tracks leading up to it, and finishing with the most balls to the wall and extreme left hook of an ending you've ever heard. And somehow it manages to not only not feel out of place at all, but even end up weirdly even more satisfying and perfect an ending that falls very much in line with the band's usual ethos. This is 808 State. They just ended their last album with Sexy Synthesizer. What fun would it be to end this album the normal way? I could go on and on about this album and how formative it is to my taste in music, how I grew up with it as a middle schooler, but I obviously already have a near 20-minute video where I do just that, so I think I'll leave it at that. I do still think 90 or XL would be much more indicative starting points than this, but Don Solaris will forever be the album of theirs that means the most to me personally. And yeah, not much else to say besides thank you to Graham Massey, Darren Partington, Martin Price, Gerald Simpson, and of course Andy Barker for all these years of incredible music that have become such giant fixtures in my life. As the saying goes, 808 State are fucking great. But of course, this is just my opinion. You can feel free to disagree with it, but I'd like to hear your thoughts, so leave the comments in the comment thing down there. Shout out to my Patreon supporters, they're awesome people. You want to add yourself to that list or make me review something, link to my Patreon is in the description. But yeah, that's pretty much it. That's all for today. See you next time.